and thank you all for joining today. We have a very esteemed panel of math experts and entrepreneurs before you. I'm going to, for the sake of time, forego introductions. Those of you guys who know these people will have no need of further elaboration on their credentials, and if you don't know them, just embrace the mystery. You're going to be very pleased. So I'm going to start with a quick kind of provocation about the premise of this entire event. And I'm going to ask everyone, presidential primary style, to raise your hand if you believe that there is a math education crisis. People in the audience and on the rostrum. Okay, so I'm going to get real contrarian today, maybe. I would like to, now that we've acknowledged everyone is bought into the idea, and I basically am too. What is the extent of our math education crisis, math learning deficits that have risen over the past couple years? Maybe we want to start with Louis.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Louis Leiboh from the Gates Foundation, and I work on our K-12 education team. And thank you for showing up. It is Wednesday, like midday. These are like the diehard math people. So thank you for coming out. I'll just say one bit. I'm curious what the others think. But like, I raised my hand halfway, and here's why. I think we've heard a lot, and I've heard at various panels and sessions about the dip in NAEP scores over the past few years, where I think the stats, if I remember correctly, are 27% at proficient and above in the US in 2022, which is obviously a major problem, and therefore a crisis, I think, especially to the extent it shines a light on the challenge, I think is totally fair. That number is down 7 points on average, I think, from a 34% number back in 2019. And that dip, my understanding is, wipes out something like 20 years of progress in math scores in the US, which is, challenging and unfortunate. And I'm having a little bit of a sort of like highly reflective week this week, because it was precisely 20 years ago that I left my speech recognition technology startup and stepped into a middle school math classroom to proceed upon the hardest job I've ever had by far as a teacher. And so to think that the progress that's been made in those subsequent 20 years has been sort of wiped out, at least for now, is obviously quite daunting. But I think the main point I'd make is it's not like 34% was particularly good. And we've had very incremental progress for decades in math the system has not supported students in our country, and particularly the students that we're focused on in our work, which is students from low-income backgrounds and Black and Latino students who've been historically underserved by the system. And so that's the halfway raise, because yes, it's a crisis, but it's been a crisis for a long time, and there's a lot the system needs to do to improve. And so I worry a little bit about the framing of the short-term nature of the framing.
Yeah. I think there are kind of two ways to attack it, actually. One would be just the one that you've laid out right now. I mean, if there's a crisis now, it seems hardly more of a crisis than there was for decades that preceded the pandemic. Perhaps in an even more deliberately contrarian strain, I mean, there certainly will be a crisis for kids whose math potential has been set back, perhaps for the duration of their K-12 careers. But I'm wondering about now the 2, or we're heading into 3 classes of kids who will be in elementary school having not been affected by COVID in the classroom. Now, their SEL skills, early childhood certainly would have been disrupted during this time. But for them, it feels as though we should potentially expect for those really familiar NAEP losses, the NWEA losses in math, to not really be a factor, I would think. I mean, is it possible that this is both a permanent math crisis in that we've never really done particularly well, and an ephemeral math crisis in that large numbers of elementary school kids now are essentially untreated by this society-wide intervention of COVID? Any thoughts?
I think it was crisis before COVID, of course, make it worse. But there are principal things which were not addressed. And for example, students go through math and many years after they say, oh, it was so boring. I got A, I didn't know anything. It's a typical sort of perception of math as something you need to memorize. It's extremely boring, which is absolutely opposite. Math is extremely, it's a creative thing. It's interesting. So that's one thing. Another thing is COVID, of course, is COVID, but we need it before, and we need even more now. We need more math. We need more math education. Math education should be different. It's about problem solving, not memorizing. So it's a lot of things which were already very bad. And if we don't change, really change, we will not get enough teachers to even to keep up. So it's a big thing. It's a whole.
So I can come at it from another angle. So I run Cuemath. That's a math tutoring one-to-one high-dosage service. So we've taught about 200,000 kids from across the world. And what we are seeing is we have kids from grades K through 12, and we are seeing that it's easier to reverse losses for younger kids, versus older kids, because math is like a compounding skill. It's like lattice, where every concept builds on previous concepts and so on. So the earlier you intervene, the earlier you set the child's relationship with the subject right and help them see math the right way, the easier it is to course correct. So we are seeing some of that in our student base, where reversing learning losses for younger kids is relatively easier compared to high school kids. Yeah.
I also wanted to build off what Alexei was saying. So I'm Jennifer, I'm from Photomath, and we run a mobile learning app that helps students on their math learning journey, starting with what are the problem are they struggling with immediately in their curriculum. But one of the things we did is we really take a very consumer-focused perspective, like what is the student feeling, how are they doing? So we run regular, several thousand, in this case, a 2,000-person survey amongst American parents as well as high school students to understand how they're feeling about math. And one of the things that really comes across is that most students just label themselves as bad at math. So they have this extremely fixed mindset, right, which is such a barrier. And we spent the last decade plus trying to talk about growth mindsets and helping students learn, and it just doesn't seem to translate in this particular area. And it's kind of this systemic thing, right? So we also interviewed parents. 60% of them said, I feel helpless in terms of helping my child with their math homework, right? So it started generations ago, this idea of I'm just not good at math, or it's not there and I can't help them. And there's all sorts of reasons why. Another 50% of them said it's because math is now taught differently. But it's this idea that they can't even reason, right? Like it's not just the procedural process that's changed, but like how do I approach it? How do I think about it? How do I teach my student or help my kid with their understanding of how to approach and problem solve that we're really struggling with here?
Yeah, I feel as though it's clear that so much of K-12 students' math anxiety is also reflective of what they're seeing in the home. And this phenomenon must have played a huge role in the math learning losses, which were comparatively much larger than the ELA losses during the pandemic. This is the old kind of aphorism that math is the school-dependent subject. It's very difficult for parents to work on math with their kids at home. You can teach your kids to read. Many parents, not all parents, can teach their kids to read. Jen, I'm hoping you can actually take us a little into the origins of Photomath, because I feel I've heard you describe this before. I mean, you were hearing complaints from parents, right, including very well-equipped parents.
So actually, the origin, it is a parent story, which is our founder, Damir Sabol, is an engineer, and he was working on OCR technology, and he's very good at math. He's like, I feel very confident in my math skills. And when he tried to teach his 14-year-old son algebra, it just did not work, right? Like he was struggling, he couldn't explain it well, he had to refresh and relearn certain concepts again. And his thought was, geez, if I'm struggling as a math engineer, right? Or like as an engineer with solid math skills, imagine all the other parents out there. And so I think that understanding of that, the problem that this is a multi-generational issue that we're talking about is one that was kind of the foundation for Photomath.
I mean, the thing I would jump in on, just on the prior point, if I could, and I'll connect it to the parents theme as well, is I appreciate the crisis framing to the extent that it shines a spotlight that generates action, but just want to make sure that the deficit orientation doesn't lead to a blame of students or teachers. Like, it is not students or teachers' fault, any of the challenges that we've described. It's an overall system issue. And even further, like, there is so much, I've seen so much so many positive things happening at this conference in schools, and like, to the extent there's educators in the room, the entrepreneurs that are here, just I'm so appreciative of their work because of how hard they work, how exhausted everyone is, and how hard the challenge is. And so I just want to make sure we remain optimistic that there are like amazing things going on that we can learn from and build from. And I think that, you know, schools obviously recognize that parents are a critical part of the equation. And the last thing I want to do is make it end up seeming like we're putting too much on parents, or that we're ultimately delegating too much of the responsibility to parents. My experience teaching was that the parents of my kids cared tremendously about their kids' education, but were very busy with often multiple jobs. They were often learning English themselves. They didn't always feel welcome and comfortable in the school, by the school environment. And I think it's up to, and so I really do want to kind of push back to think about what the schools and the system can be doing to be including parents by leveraging tools like Photomath, leveraging high quality curriculum, and make sure that they're kind of included in the partnership, and that we're not leaving it to parents, things that the system should be solving for.
Well, that's actually a good place to come in, Louis, to ask you to talk a little more about what the Gates Foundation has been doing in math, not only over years, but more recently, it was announced last fall that there would be a pretty significant reprioritization of math within the Gates Foundation, education portfolio. And it's based a lot around, I know, math pathways, making math more relevant. Can you give me a sense of the foundation's conception of the parent's role and parent engagement, if there is one?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, and we actually just released some numbers this week that parents believe that math is incredibly important to students' future careers and potential, and that's the reason that we decided to prioritize math in the first place, right? We know that if you pass algebra, students that don't pass algebra by 9th grade, like twice as likely to graduate from high school, much more likely to go on to college, successful careers, et cetera. And so we know that 9th grade algebra sort of moment is critical. We know that sort of student mindsets, to the point about math people, start young. Often 3rd grade is cited as a time when students start believing they can't be a math person. And so parents are just such a critical role, critical part of the equation. But like I said, we're taking a sort of systems view to the challenge, and looking in particular at how high quality curriculum and tools can play a really important role in improving math education. I've already mentioned teachers a couple of times. Teachers need to be receiving more effective professional development, pre-service training. We're thinking about how we can support school districts in implementing coherent math instruction. And across all of those areas, and this is the team that I'm on, so can probably speak to it a little bit more, there's a need for research and development. There's a need for innovation, and there's a need for that to happen using design methods that include students, teachers, and parents in the design of the products that are supporting them. So we think parents are a hugely important, critical part of the equation.
Well, Tempus Fugit, we're 15 minutes into this panel, and no one has mentioned ChatGPT or AI, and I know that's what we're all here to talk about. The whole world, and certainly this building, has been abuzz with talk of the potential of AI and emergent technologies and tools to help address this math crisis, which, to end all suspense, yeah, I do think there is something of a math crisis. I'd like to know, I just put it to the panel, I mean, what is the promise as you see it, whether as academics, entrepreneurs, in the philanthropy space, how can we harness AI in the near term to try to trigger learning recovery, and what does it betoken for math instruction going forward? Anybody?
Yeah, I can go first. I think firstly, in the post-GPT world, we should maybe redefine the objectives of good math learning to some extent. I mean, the answers are no longer important. It's the process of getting to the answer. It's the process of thinking and new creativity and critical thinking and so on. And that's what we should be pushing students towards as they'll pick up new math skills. In that process, I think technologies like GPT would be a great enabler. You know, you could have tutors enabled in real time to respond better to student queries. You could have students having co-pilot bots that tell them what to do next, and so on. So in my, from my perspective and vantage point, I actually see the winning strategy to be AI-assisted teachers, AI-assisted human tutors, and that's what could potentially lead to most gains. So if we can incorporate GPT and the likes into teaching and learning workflows, I actually think it's incredibly exciting. And I'm not really in the camp of narratives where people are saying GPT will replace teachers and so on. I don't think that's going to happen. But I think finding the right combination of human and AI to do the teaching and to do the learning would be the right direction to explore. Yeah.
I'll build off of that. I think there's obviously a lot of excitement and opportunity, particularly around content generation. And we've talked a lot about the US so far, but trying to serve as a global audience, particularly for Photomath, we have the app available in 30 plus languages and reaching 200 plus countries. For us, it's actually how do we provide the same level of product and ability to help students, whether or not they're studying in Bahasa Indonesian, or they're studying in English in Florida, right? So for us, it's actually thinking about how we can really create high quality content at scale across multiple different languages and across different learning styles. That becomes really, really interesting. But I think everything that Manan highlighted is really important. At the end of the day, it's really, math education's got the shift to also really emphasize the application of math and get students really excited about that. And the one area that we need to be extremely cautious of is that the agency, it's extremely important for students to have agency within their education and to direct it, right? To have that intrinsic motivation in combination with agency to say, this is what I want to learn, this is how I'm going to learn it next. And what we don't want these AI tutors to do is become overly prescriptive, right? Where the student just expects to, oh, you're going to teach me what I need to know, and if I make a mistake, you're then going to spoon feed me everything, right? We want that inquiry coming from the student still, so it becomes the Sherpa or co-pilot, whatever fun word you want to use, along with the student, but isn't necessarily it's not directing the student. The direction needs to come from the student and the teacher in collaboration together.
Alexei, soothe my concerns about the rise of the machines. I think nobody wants or perhaps expects at this moment for human instruction or tutoring to be fully supplanted by AI, but it does seem like it could be an incredible bounty to kids who are struggling. I mean, just out in the hallway, we were talking about the challenge of learning math in another language. That's something that tens, hundreds of millions of people try to do. What do you think AI can offer? And be a futurist.
I like ChatGPT. I like to talk to it as a mathematician. It's interesting. I think it's not anything which would change math education right now. And I think perception quite often, what it can do, it's not what we want it to do. For example, it answers questions, but it doesn't have mathematical culture. For example, in math, it's important if you don't know, you say, I don't know. Tolerance to mistake is 0. It's not like history or something. Tolerance to mistake is 0. So ChatGPT confidently gives wrong answer, for example. So it's not ready right now. But there are more limitations I see if you look at it as a replacement of everything. But how I look at it, ChatGPT is a smart thing. It uses already mathematical algorithms. When it solves the problem, it's correct and steps are given because it uses math algorithms from I don't know what, but from Wolfram Alpha or Sage or something. So there are math engines there, and they use it because I don't believe that you can train a machine to produce this type of algorithms right now or in the near future. So what we want from ChatGPT, or what we actually want, we want to have an ideal tutor, as I look at it. Sits nearby, shows you mistakes precisely in the moment they made, and gives hints when needed. But it's not intrusive. It's just precisely instant help as needed. Maybe little instruction, two lines. Of course, ChatGPT cannot do it. So ideal tutor should be, intelligent tutor should be 3 parts. Math algorithms, I'm a mathematician first place. Then it should be a tutor which based on math algorithms which knows what precisely the mistake is and what the hint. Right now, if you ask what to do, ChatGPT gives you the whole solution. Basically, you're asking your teacher, what should I do? And said, read this section in the book. It's not good. It's a little hint you need. So it's math engine which is tutor. It's not algorithm how to solve the problem, but how to help. And ChatGPT, it's a great thing. It's a media between students and all these engines. It can verbalize. We know what the mistake is. So it can verbalize properly for a particular student. It can be adaptive. It can be sort of human in a sense. How to make a hint, it's important. Not to frustrate students, not to show, anyway. So this is great media which was missing. But also, there is right now people say, oh, AI. Of course AI is AI, it's good. But you don't know what to do really. But when you know what to do, math algorithms are better. So it's a huge area. There is an area of math algorithms, and you can add and add and add and increase. And there is a gray area where you don't know what to do. AI is great here. So it's a second role of ChatGPT. If you ask how to solve a problem, go to TI. If you want to talk about math, you go to your professor. So ChatGPT can be part of it as well. And strange questions, new questions that it's not already in the math algorithm world. So this area is also ChatGPT. So it's a media, but it's how to connect to math machines, basically, to engines. That's how I see it. I personally think it's a great tool, and there must be 3 parts. I'm here, the last thing I said. Sorry, I'm here as a mathematician, but actually we have a company, Gradarius, who making this tutor. When I came to Stevens, our administration wanted us to do a program that will help professors to teach calculus. So we were doing, and finally we have this tutor that we tried with ASU to build this intelligent tutor for all math courses. So it will be pre-algebra this summer and calculus this coming fall, and the whole sort of area in a year. So to have ChatGPT integrated into it, that's what we are doing, would be absolutely great thing.
It's good to get your perspective as somebody who's trying to harness AI as a tool from the ground up to work with students. I'm interested in hearing your perspectives, Manan and Jen. You've launched and you're growing incredible ventures to help educate kids. I'm wondering, we've talked about the potential of LLMs and GPT. I'm wondering about the challenges, right? Because you've got to adapt a business model to adopt a cutting-edge technology. which is going to be really expensive to implement, to take full advantage of. And it's difficult enough, I realize, to scale your startups to begin with without also being like on the last page of a science fiction novel. Take me through it.
Yeah, so at Cuemath, essentially our core service is tutorial sessions that our tutors run with students. And if you look at that 1 hour environment, the 60 minutes of magic as we call it, right? There's a lot going on in that session. You have the student thinking, saying something, writing on the whiteboard, responding to the teacher cues. You know, there are all kinds of non-verbal signals. The student is getting switched off and so on. And a human tutor is adept at reading those signals and forming a cohesive 360-degree view of what's really going on in the child's mind. How are they thinking? How are they responding? Is there any new math gains being generated in their mind and so on, right? I think in that context, something like GPT will not obviously fully be able to do all of this, like what a human tutor can do, but can own parts of that experience. So maybe the hint that is generated to the student at any point could be GPT generated, or maybe the next best question that comes up could be GPT generated. But see, ultimately the goal of a tutorial in our context is generating new math gains. The child should exit the tutorial with having learned something new. And I think from a GPT context, it's only part of the answer. So we are actually, as I said earlier, we actually see this more as an enabler rather than a disruptor. I think it's an incredible tool for tutors to to just teach better. For example, if my student likes, I don't know, soccer, so maybe I can generate 10 new contexts using soccer as the background, and I can just get across my ideas more efficiently across to the student. So in that context, GPT is a great enabler. But as I said, my sense is the winning strategy would be an expert human tutor enabled by these tools and these superpowers. To just get that thinking generated in the child's mind, because that's the real goal of education. You want the student to be able to think. I mean, the mind is the reasoning engine, right? You want the student to be able to reason, and ChatGPT could own part of that, but is not, obviously not a replacement. So I think the days of an AI tutor superseding the best human tutor seems to me to be far away, but then obviously GPT has reset a lot of expectations. So we need to see how that pans out.
So I think you pose a lot of interesting things as like, how do we help tutors become better, right? But at the end of the day, that's great. We can increase the number of qualified and highly skilled tutors that are providing help for students. On Photomath side, I would agree with a lot of what you said. We think of it also though, like if you can't have a human around, what can be done? And I think that at the end of it's still actually a lot of the similar problems, which is, it is a very powerful tool, but in technology, it's how you apply it in a way that is actually meaningful and useful for the student, right? So it really comes back to the user experience. And where can we utilize it to provide the right piece of information, the right context, or the right prompt, in a way that's actually doing the correct job to be done of a good tutor. And I think it's actually very little to do about the technology and everything to do about the product and product development. And that's actually just not, it is hard to build good product, right? You really have to deeply understand what is the student's need or what is the parent's need, how does that fit in context with the school, and what is the right balance of giving information, the push and the pull and all that kind of stuff. And all these things are I didn't say anything technical because they're not really, at the end of the day, technical decisions. And I think that's, for us, the real consideration. How do you apply the technology in a really meaningful way? Either to support and amplify the quality of a tutor, or if you can't have a tutor around, how do we continue doing that? So it's a UX problem.
They all are.
I'm really glad that you went to the, what are the use cases? How is this actually going to support teachers and students? Not the sort of technology's a silver bullet first. Because, obviously, ChatGPT is very high on the hype cycle at the moment. That's okay. Potentially, eventually, there'll be the trough, but then productivity will come from it. I haven't heard a teacher say, man, if only ChatGPT could teach all my kids math, that's the dream I have been waiting for. I have heard teachers optimistic that it can support students' learning, more optimistic than I would have expected in this early stage, and so that's promising. But I think some of these other use cases that aren't just like, what is the chat interface, are super interesting, right? So in the tutoring use case, like how can you figure out, there's a lot of talk about tutoring the past few years. Not every kid needs high dosage tutoring that costs $3,000 a student. It'd be nice, but not every kid needs that at all times. Some kids maybe need an online tutor to sort of swoop in for 15 or 20 minutes and help a student with a particular concept they're struggling on. Some students maybe just need to like reach out to some of the sort of more proactive on-demand types of tutoring supports. And some of them maybe could work with a chatbot. And that's different for different students at different times. And so I've seen initiatives, for example, at Carnegie Mellon, where they're thinking about sort of the triage model of how do you use AI and a bunch of other techniques to figure out which student needs what types of tutoring at what moments in time. And that's a more scalable solution than a lot of the sort of high dosage solutions that are unfortunately really expensive, even though they're extremely effective. So I think that's one example. The other, I think if we broaden GPT to think more generally about natural language processing, giving feedback to tutors is such a really, that can really supercharge them. And so a lot of interesting work going on around like audio analysis to be able to give feedback to teachers and tutors. Like there's a company called TeachFX and research happening at Stanford and CU Boulder that are all thinking about how can we take audio recordings of tutoring sessions, of classroom audio, and figure out how do we actually give useful feedback to teachers basically in real time or right after that lesson. I think that's a really interesting use case for artificial intelligence because it doesn't replace the humans. It supercharges the teachers, the tutors, and supercharges the coach. The coach that came and saw me came into my classroom every couple of months at best because they had many, many teachers to support. And so give them a bunch more data about what was happening in my classroom and they'd be an even more supercharged coach. So I think those are some examples of some of the ways that I see AI being sort of pragmatically like applied and really supporting teachers and students in the short term.
I want to quickly pull the conversation back and think about the policy side of it. It's not something that we talk about a ton in the education-specific world, but the federal research apparatus around technologies that could conceivably come out of recent discoveries in AI is big and it's growing. The federal government in the United States is trying to expand the Institute for Education Sciences. This is one of the most important developments in education over the last year that you probably didn't hear about. They're trying to create what they're calling a DARPA for education, which would help develop or accelerate the development of breakthrough education technologies on the kind of model of a Silicon Valley or an ed tech type of business development. That's exciting. That's the United States government. There are also world governments all around. I mean, I know, Manan, you operate out of India. I'm wondering what, if any, are the possibilities of the public and private sector, possibly the philanthropic sector, coming together to try to bring some of these learning solutions online faster.
I've got tons of thoughts on this, but I've been talking too much, so please. All right, I'll try to keep it crisp. I think it's very exciting that there's some momentum in this area. For way too long, education research and development has been very underfunded compared to other fields. And there's a particular space that it's been underfunded, which is, it's been underfunded probably across the board, but there's a particular space that's of interest, I think, in this notion that you were describing, which is not the basic research happening and not the commercialization of products, but that middle space in between of sort of applied research, a little bit of invention. How are you going after some bold moonshot problems and sort of really building some real solutions that will help classroom teachers? There's a space in there that's sort of between the pure research and the pure commercialization that's really been underfunded and is really necessary. And I think that's what some of this government funding that you're referring could help with. The two principles that I would love to see it really focus on are, one, bringing together some groups that have been siloed forever, which is researchers, product developers, and educators. Each of those three groups has very different incentive systems, very different languages, doesn't talk to each other often enough. And so that type of funding can actually bring those groups together to work on problems with each other. And then secondly is to do that in more inclusive ways. Underserved students and the teachers that support them have not been involved in the design processes. They're usually tested upon rather than helping to define what the solutions might even be. And so how can you approach this R&D in an inclusive way, I think is the second principle that I'd love to see this type of funding go towards. And there's some models that are getting built up that can demonstrate how to do this. One of the things that we've had the chance to work on is supporting the launch of an organization called the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund, which is sort of taking this inclusive R&D approach that I described, and they're focusing on executive function and math and assessments and literacy initially. But I think that type of approach is a really exciting example of the type of R&D that I'm hopeful that the government will fund more of.
We're about to start winding down, but I wanted to ask you, Jen and Manan, about what the last couple of years have been like as business leaders in an era of incredible growth for education technology. What was bad for mankind was kind of great for ed tech over the last few years. There are potentially founders in this room. Certainly there are founders and people with great ideas here in this hotel. What's it been like, and what are the challenges of navigating a market that is probably on its way to contraction now at last, but that has a lot of potential for growth in the future?
Yeah, I think for us, the COVID and post-COVID phase led to huge growth. Pre-COVID, we were still an India-centric company, but as we went online during the COVID years, we started expanding across the world. Got huge demand from all over the place. Today we operate in, it's a long tail, but we operate in about 70 plus countries across the world. US is a big market for us. And all of that got accelerated during that period when parents were willing to try out new solutions and so on. But I think the interesting thing is even post the COVID phase and as normalization has started to happen, our demand continues to grow. I think math is just one of those things where it's going to be a universal need forever. And parents do want their kids to just keep getting better at math. So we are actually seeing sustained growth even post the whole COVID kind of phase normalizing. And I think the challenges have been more around operationalizing the whole growth. How do you keep your acquisition costs under control? How do you make sure your lifetime values are high? Your students are finding value in your service, and ultimately you can boil down your entire business to what's your lifetime value on the consumer and what's the acquisition cost, and your LTV is a function of how much outcomes you're able to demonstrate with the kid to the parent and so on. And if you kind of stick to that, I think math is a great space to be. It's never going away. So yeah, that's been the broad learning for us. I think you can just build so many different kinds of massive businesses in the math learning space because it's such a universal need. 1 billion kids need to learn math. So yeah, that's the broad thoughts.
I would just add that maybe the silver lining to it was that it raised the discussion into the general conversation, right? And it's because many people, parents, were put in the place of, all of a sudden being math teachers again when they had no intention. And these parents were policymakers, these parents were funders, these parents were, it's people that in the past when you'd have to talk about how important math education is, it was like a 10, 15-minute intro. And then after, I think as people kind of really experienced it, had the joys and struggles of being teachers at home, that kind of conversation got shrunk a lot more, and it became elevated into a much broader context. So I think the silver lining is that we are now recognizing, understanding, and reinvesting in this conversation again. And then the rest of it, as Manan said, is just the ups and downs and cyclical funds of being a startup.
Right, well put. And I want to thank all my lovely panelists for joining me today. It was a very nice conversation. And thank you all for coming in as well. Hope you learned something. They're going to turn this room over. So if you'd like to stick around and speak to some of the panelists, and provided you're interested in that, by all means, meet us out in the hallway outside. Thank you.